noted conservationist. He's a rock star in conservation, if there ever was a rock star in conservation. And we're very, very honored and delighted that he came here to share some closing remarks with us. And then after that, Claire Kamanzi from the Rwanda Development Board will give us a vote of thanks and some closing remarks from our partner, the RDB, as well. So thank you again for coming and for sharing the last few days with us. And let's welcome Sanjayan.
Thank you, Fred, for that fantastic introduction. I was going to say you could have the 15 minutes if we could make that $12 million for the commitment there. So appreciate everyone taking the time to hang out and hear a few words. Much of what I want to say has already been said before in various dialogues and forums yesterday and today. And so I'll try to give you a little bit of a big picture from our perspective. Or my perspective and the evolution of my thinking and my change over time. So I was born in Sri Lanka, tiny island nation in the Indian Ocean. When I was born, my grandmother took me to see an astrologer. They do this when you're born as a baby. And the astrologer looked at my head and looked at the hair patterns on my head, because they don't read the palms of the baby, they read the way the hair grows, and told my grandmother that I would die by drowning. Okay? So my grandmother, the matriarch of the family, comes back and tells the family to keep me out of the water, which is exactly what they did. So even though I was born literally on the ocean, I was not allowed to go into the water, to the point where we even had a shower installed in our home, probably the first shower in Colombo at the time, so that I wouldn't have to go into the water, be immersed in water. And that was the case, and made perfect sense, right? If you know you're going to die by drowning, stay out of the water seems like a perfectly reasonable strategy to have. But then when I was about 5 years old, we moved to Africa. My family moved to Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, my mother broke with tradition and taught me how to swim. And it completely changed my life's trajectory after that. And it has taken me a long time to think about why she did that. It's not like my mother is a great swimmer. I'm actually not even sure she knows how to swim. I actually learned how to swim not in the ocean, but literally in a pond left by diamond mining. That's where my first swimming lessons were. And that has something to do with, I think, my own evolution and my own trajectory as a conservationist. So can we have the first slide? All right, so what's the greatest market failure in human history? So Nicholas Stern says that the greatest market failure in human history is our complete underestimation of the cost of climate change. That our inability to incorporate the true cost of climate really is going to be seen as the biggest cost to companies. And they estimate it as $1 trillion over the next 5 years. Those are very big numbers. It's very difficult to know. It probably is, in truth, much, much bigger than that. The interesting thing is that the growing demand to decarbonize the economy is creating about $2 trillion in opportunities. There's twice as much opportunity in decarbonizing, say, over the next decade as there is in terms of cost. For me, for us, I think that provides an opportunity to think about conservation as a growth industry. That's not, unlike JC, that's really me up there. I'm not going to say, no, that's not me. I'm just standing in the office like this. I put that slide up there because I think, like many of you in this audience, I love nature. That's where I came from. For me, nature was something that I describe in the language of love. And I still have a place in a Western American state called Montana. And in Montana, I like going for a walk in the woods because I know that there's something bigger than me that can come out and kill me. And that makes it really exciting when I go walking in the woods. But that value proposition that go protect the forest or go for a walk in nature because it might kill you doesn't really work for most of the planet. And I fully recognize that. So when I came to America as a graduate student, what I wanted to do is I wanted to study cheetahs. I'd grown up in Africa, and I thought, big cats. Actually, I was going to go study in Namibia. Namibia was a recently, newly independent country, and that was where I was going to go. And just before I got on the plane, I mean, quite literally a month before I was leaving to Namibia, my entire project got canceled. And I don't want to go into the story about that, why. It had nothing to do with me. It really had to do with the fallout with the US government that was partly supporting my work. And so I was in school in California, and I had to quickly find something else to study. And the only thing that was around me was an animal called a gopher. Now, for those of you who don't know what a gopher is, it's basically a rat that lives underground, okay? And it lives in farmlands all over the United States, but certainly all over California. And that's what I did. So gone were my vision of sitting on top of a Land Rover with my Swarovski binoculars around my neck, with a gin and tonic at sunset, watching a cheetah under the African savanna was gone. Instead, I spent 3 years digging in the dirt to try to capture underground rats. Okay, that was it. And in doing that, I spent a lot of time with farmers in America, farmers in California, the farmers who we as conservationists never had the opportunity to speak to. And we had to break down those barriers. But to make a long story short, I became friendly with many of those people. And when I would go onto their land, to their ranch, when I would say, oh, I love to hear, you know, the foxes howl, or I would love to see wildflowers, or I love to see the birds in the sky, or I'd love to go look at the springs that irrigated their property, for them, they would say the same thing to me, but they would not use that same language as me. Instead of using a language of love, they would use a language of value. So they would say things like, I'm really scared about what's going to happen to this land. I worry about my children being able to make a living in agriculture in this area. I worry about climate change and how it's drying out the soil. Even back then, 20 years ago, they were understanding the impacts of climate change. They weren't talking about it yet, but they knew that the soil was drying out faster than before. And I came to this giant realization, something that has driven me and driven my organization, Conservation International, you know, since that point, whereas that when our language is a language of love as conservationists, we love nature, for most people on the planet, it has to be a language of value if we have any hope to scale it. So this is a cover from The Economist, but this is a long time ago. This is probably about 10 years ago. The Economist put a dollar sign on the forest. And they were basically asking a very simple question, you know, who pays for nature? And it's taken all of us a long, long, long time to come to an understanding that really nature can pay for itself and much, much more. So the big thing that I want to talk to you a little bit about today is carbon and the potential for carbon markets. So if you think about deforestation, if deforestation was a country, the emissions from deforestation would be the third largest in the world. So you'd have China, the United States, and deforestation. 30% of our solution to get the Paris Climate Accord has to come from protecting nature. Think about that. That's incredible, if you really think about that. How big a role our impact on nature has on climate change. And yet, only about 2% of the funding that is available, today it's somewhere around $80 billion that goes into decarbonizing. Only about 2% of that money goes actually into protecting forests. To me, that's insane. Forests are the only technology we have at scale that can actually reverse carbon emissions, right? It's the only thing that can actually suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold it in living tissue. Nothing else can do it. Nothing even comes close to doing it at scale. That, to me, is a massive, massive opportunity. But it's been very, very difficult for conservationists to get that message across in the forums that dominate the conversation about the new decarbonized economy. But I think it really is starting to change. So I want to talk to you about one project in Kenya. So the Chulu Hill, some of you might have been there, it's part of the Amboseli ecosystem. It provides some of the water that ends up in Mombasa, the second biggest city in Kenya. It's an incredible place. So last year, we brought about 2 million carbon credits to market in the Chulu Hills. So we worked with the Maasai community there, several group ranches, the Maasai Wilderness Trust, Africa Wildlife Foundation, Kenya Wildlife Service, Big Life, and a coalition of partners to really understand how much carbon is protected in the Chulus, how much is at risk, and then brought it to market. And interestingly, we found buyers. It's high-quality carbon. It's well-designed. They can be assured that it is really being protected, and the benefits are accruing to communities. So one of the first organizations that stepped up to buy some of these credits was Tiffany's, the jewelry company. So Tiffany's Foundation offset some of their carbon emissions through buying the credits from the Chulus. And in the next few months, we'll be announcing another new partner, more in the technology space, who will do the same thing in this landscape. And I just wanted to point that out as a local example where carbon can be sold to provide funding for conservation groups, but also community groups that are working there. And I truly believe that within, say, the next 3 years, the biggest source of income in that conservation landscape will be through the carbon market, not through philanthropy, which has been the primary driver of the conservation work that has happened there, as well as tourism is a very important part of it, but also has significant costs associated with running it. So I had the chance of either putting up a picture of Greta, putting up a picture of Andre Hoffman, because they were both making exactly the same point. I picked Greta on this one. But Andre made a very interesting point yesterday, right? So he said that businesses have really started making a shift today from stakeholders to shareholders. I think that is a real trend. I don't think that is a fad. I think that is going to stick. I think companies, major companies in the United States, have really all signed on to this idea that they are there for a social compact with society, that they're licensed to operate as a big company. If you're a Unilever, for example, or your Apple or your Walmart, really does come from not the shareholders, but the social license really comes from the stakeholders. Greta is making the same point in a very different way, basically saying this young generation is impatient for change. It's going to put so much pressure on companies that they're going to be forced to act much, much sooner than they thought possible. And I can tell you, honestly, this is exactly what's happening. I was talking to some colleagues here today about the oil and gas industry. So 6-7 years ago, we were standing outside the oil and gas industry offices trying to get a meeting. About 3 or 4 years ago, they invited us into their lobby. About 2 years ago, we were able to sit down and actually have conversations with them. Today, their CEOs are coming to ask us for meetings. When I say us, I don't mean CI alone. I mean the conservation community or the environment community at large. There's been a dramatic shift when you think about the way in which companies, even the oil and gas industry now, is treating conservation. If you go to the World Economic Forum, Davos, what's shocking about Davos is that, say, last year, the highlight, the plenary, was a conversation between Prince William, Duke of Cambridge, and David Attenborough. That was the opening session of Davos. The opening talk that happened there between 4 CEOs of big companies like Walmart, Cargill, Unilever, and one other that I'm forgetting right now. But the major talk that they all gave was about their responsibilities in terms of the environment. In fact, the CEO of Unilever, Alan Jope, the new guy who just took over, said that he doesn't want to be known as the CEO of branded litter. That when he walks down the beach, his daughter points out and says, "Dad, you made that, you made that, you made that, you made that, you made that." That is not a legacy that he wants to leave. There is an impatience that is happening in the world that is prompted by both companies, but primarily by younger people who are impatient for change. And they're going to hold those companies really accountable for it. And for that, I think there is the opportunity to unlock the power of conservation for social good. Now, companies is not enough. You also need governments. And sometimes we make this mistake to think if you only work with companies, you can make things happen. But government policies can so easily swamp out even the best things that a company is trying to do. This is a swamp in Colombia. It's a mangrove swamp in Colombia. Colombia did something remarkable a year or so ago. Colombia created a national carbon tax. So if you use carbon, fossil fuels, any kind of like that, there's a tax on it. Colombia did one thing unusual. Several other countries have carbon taxes as well. But Colombia's carbon tax allowed for a part of that tax to be used to protect nature. Guess how much money it's creating for conservation of forests today in Colombia? $250 million a year. $250 million a year for carbon projects, for protecting forests in Colombia. Here's the amazing thing about Colombia right now. Colombia is the only place that I can personally think of where demand for projects is completely outstripping supply. They have more money to spend on carbon projects than there are projects available. So one of the things we're doing, along with others, is working furiously in Colombia to bring good conservation projects. In this case, this is a coastline, 27,000 hectares of mangrove forest on the coast of Colombia that we brought to market this year. Because that's where things stand in Colombia, where the carbon tax is allowing them to invest in nature at a scale never seen before. For countries, frankly, like Rwanda, Uganda, countries that have forests, this could be a huge potential new opportunity to not only create a market, but to also bring businesses who are willing to invest in those markets there. For this 27,000 hectare forest that I'm showing you here in Colombia, the sale of that carbon was to Apple. And so Apple invested in protecting this forest as an offset for some of the work that they are doing there. So Conservation International has taken a big role in trying to do and bring a lot of these carbon projects to market. To date, we are the biggest, by far, private enterprise that brings carbon projects to market. And currently, we bring about $30 million worth of carbon projects to market. The reason why this is fuzzy is because, in truth, we need at least one other zero to this. We really need like two other zeros to this. It really should be $300 million, or even better, $3 billion worth of carbon projects to market. The potential is there. The market is developing very, very quickly. If we can do it at $30 million scale, I have seen no reason why that couldn't continue to scale up. Currently, the projects we work on is in about 12 countries. So, yeah, it's a lot of money, but it's not really that much money when you think about the scale of the problem. So clearly, conservation can work in our benefit. Clearly, conservation can create economic demand and drive investments to it. But there are other ways of doing this as well. So we heard about NatureVest, which is a really interesting model of trying to drive private investments into conservation. At the different scale of NatureVest, we created a fund called Conservation Ventures. So it's a relatively small fund, about $20 million or so, but it had a really interesting purpose. The idea for Conservation Ventures was to provide loans, not grants, but loans, to small and medium-sized businesses that were trying to escape to become big and attract real capital that can just support them. So it turns out that for many green businesses, there isn't the ability to attract capital. They don't have collateral, they don't have a credit record. The way in which people in the West think about risk in places like Africa or Latin America is very different from people in those regions. We wanted to find a way to de-risk those projects. There's a lot of money out there, $6, $7, $8, $10 billion, floating around looking for green investments. The amazing thing is that those people who have that money aren't willing to actually put it in places that actually matter. And so our fund, what it tries to do is tries to bridge that gap and de-risk these projects. So this is one example of a coffee project. I picked coffee because we're in Rwanda, a great coffee-producing nation. It's a project in Peru. This project basically has quadrupled its yield while cutting down on deforestation by 50%, all in the last 5 years. We've done that by providing a loan to a cooperative in order to help them scale their business in such a way that they get better coffee, but also, importantly, they protect the forest better. And guess what? They've paid us back. So we know that this can work, but we need to be willing to take those risks that, frankly, investors and boutique funds in Europe and in North America aren't willing to do that yet, simply because the way they see risk is different to the way we do. So if I say, if climate change is the worst market failure in human history, then I truly believe that conservation industry is the mechanism for its greatest success. I think that we all are sitting on the cusp of a true revolution. And I feel both scared and incredibly optimistic about the potential for this sea change to happen. We know that carbon, nature, is going to be an increasingly important commodity, increasingly of important value to the future. And we know that the investments to it are only going to scale up. We've got to do it thoughtfully. It can't be greenwashing. It has to really make a difference. It has to benefit local communities and stakeholders at the end of the day. But I do think that you're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years a massive ramp up. And when I say massive, I mean going from 30 million to 300 million to 3 billion and more in terms of investments coming into blue carbon, forest conservation, soil carbon, as well as enterprises that are based on the value of nature. So I told you I have been thinking a lot about why my grandmother and my mother differed so much in how they saw my future. And only as an adult I really understood what was going on with them. My grandmother loved me. And because she loved me and she knew her time with me was limited, she wanted to protect me. So she put her arms around me and said, "Don't put this kid in water. If you put the kid in water, he might drown." My mother, I'm sure, also loved me. But my mother also was investing in my future. For my mother, it was about value at the end of the day. She wanted to give me a fighting chance because that's what mothers do. They don't do this, they do this. And that's what I think the difference was between these two amazing women in my life, both wanting the best for me, one trying to protect me, just like we try to do with nature. We want to protect elephants and rhinos, want to hold them like this and keep them safe, and valuing it and saying, no, the real reason for all of this is because they create value. And at the end of the day, the only way people will protect them at scale is if they do it in their own enlightened self-interest. Thank you.